Greetings, everyone, and welcome to Chapter 10 of E-Learning and the Science of Instruction by Ruth Clark and Richard Mayer. I am Jimmy Knapp, and in this chapter we will be discussing the multimedia principles of segmenting and pre-training. Our agenda for Chapter 10 will include two parts, so that the application of each principle can be examined specifically. Part 1 will include the introduction to multimedia principles, defining the segmenting principle, rationale for using the segmenting principle, practical solutions, and worked examples with feedback. Part 2 will include defining the pre-training principle, rationale for using the pre-training principle, practical solutions, worked examples and feedback, and a summary of multimedia principles we examined. The multimedia principles of segmenting and pre-training are closely related because they both address reducing the complexity of instruction that involves essential cognitive processing. Both principles focus on techniques for managing essential cognitive processing for learners, which is when the amount of essential cognitive processing needed to make sense of the essential materials exceeds the learner's cognitive capacity. This is particularly important when the material is complex or unfamiliar to the learner. The segmenting principle is simply breaking a complex or continuous lesson into smaller, bite-sized segments. This way you can help the learner manage the complexity by breaking the lesson into manageable segments. Segments that convey just one or two steps in the process or a procedure, or describe just one or two key elements of a concept. It is recommended that you break a complex lesson into smaller parts, which are presented one at a time. This recommendation is an example of the segmenting principle. When a lesson is complex, or the material is completely new to the learner, it is paramount to the learning experience that instruction be consumed by the learner at a pace in which the material can be cognitively processed. Failure to do so may result in a causal chain of instruction that no longer makes sense, because the material is sequentially or conceptually dependent upon the learner understanding every segment of instruction. If a learner is unfamiliar with the material, more time may be needed to consolidate what was just presented. Consequently, when an unfamiliar learner receives a continuous presentation containing a lot of interrelated concepts, the likely result is that the cognitive system becomes overloaded. Let's discuss some practical solutions for the segmenting principle. The practical design remedy for reducing cognitive overload is to take a complex or continuous lesson and then to break it into manageable chunks for the learner. This may mean that an instructional lesson that includes 10 steps or 10 concepts is broken into 10 instructional segments, or whatever amount is appropriate so that the lesson becomes manageable for the learner. The key element to the segmenting principle is that the learner is given control of the pace of instruction. This is often done with the use of a continue or next button so that the learner is able to control their own navigation and the pace of instruction. In summary, using segmenting allows the learner to engage in essential processing without overloading the learner's cognitive system. That is, it allows the learner to manage their own essential cognitive processing. We can use scenario 1 to further examine the segmenting principle. As we watch this instructional tutorial designed to teach middle school students the principles of the water cycle, reflect upon the segmenting principle and how the principle is or is not being applied, and reflect upon how you might make the learning of the principles of the water cycle more manageable for the learner, especially if this instruction is new to the learner.
Water is essential to all life on Earth. But how is the water dispersed? This animation shows one molecule of water completing the water cycle. Heat from the sun causes the molecule to evaporate from the ocean's surface. Once it evaporates, it is transported into and through the atmosphere, where water vapor condenses, releasing its heat to form clouds. The water molecule might move halfway around the world before it falls as rain or snow. Once on land, it will either re-evaporate, be used by a plant, drain to the water table, or enter a stream. Streams and rivers bring the water molecule back to where it started, the ocean. Soon, the water molecule will begin its journey again. Now you know how the water cycle, powered by the sun, distributes water and heat around the world.
Review what we observed during the water cycle tutorial. Was the segmenting principle applied to this instructional tutorial? The answer is no, and a learner who is new to these concepts could be easily overwhelmed in trying to make sense of the essential material. Although the learner was given some control of the presentation, the concepts were presented in a continuous manner that may cause essential cognitive overload, especially if the water cycle concepts were new to the learner. Let's reflect on how the segmenting principle could be applied in this scenario. What if that same instructional tutorial was broken into 8 manageable segments that reflect the most complex principles of the water cycle? Here is how that same instruction could be presented using the segmenting principle so that essential processing is managed. Here we see the continuous lesson on the water cycle broken into 8 manageable chunks that represent the most complex concepts of the water cycle. Concepts like evaporation, condensation, or precipitation. When the segmenting principle is applied, the learner is able to engage with the tutorials at a pace that makes essential cognitive processing more manageable and allows the learner to control their pace of instruction. In summary, the segmenting principle is founded upon reducing cognitive overload by taking a complex or a continuous lesson and breaking it into manageable chunks for the learner. And I hope this helped to gain a better understanding of the segmenting principle. Let's transition and discuss the pre-training principle. The pre-training principle is another strategy to design instruction when the learner is overloaded with the need to engage in essential processing. Like the segmenting principle, the pre-training principle is quite literal. It is to provide pre-training prior to main modules of instruction with the names and characteristics of the key concepts that are paramount for the learner to achieve learning mastery of the instructional content. For example, before viewing a narrated animation on how a combustion engine works, learners could receive pre-training in which they learn the names and locations of key engine parts such as pistons, piston rings, crankshafts, spark plugs, valves, or etc. This would provide the context needed to understand how a combustion engine works. The rationale for the pre-training principle is simple. The pre-training principle is relevant to learning conditions when trying to process the essential material of a lesson that would overwhelm the learner's cognitive system. In these situations involving complex material, it would be helpful if some of the processing could be done in advance, hence pre-training. Pre-training can help learners of new and complex instruction to manage their cognitive processing of complex material by reducing the amount of essential processing they do at the time of the main presentation. Consequently, the rationale for the pre-training principle is that it helps to manage the learner's essential processing by redistributing some of it to the pre-training portion of the lesson. Let's visit some practical solutions for the pre-training principle. To implement the pre-training principle, evaluate the material you want to teach, such as a procedure or how a process works. If the material is new or complex for the learners, then identify key concepts that could be presented prior to teaching the main lesson. This material will be the focus of instruction during pre-training. Keep pre-training lessons relatively short and succinct, as the focus is only on those key concepts necessary for the understanding of the main lesson. After the pre-training of key concepts, learners can move into the main lesson, such as describing how to complete a process, with the cognitive focus placed upon the process rather than the key concepts that support that process. We can use scenario 2 to further examine the pre-training principle. We can do so by rewatching the water cycle tutorial, but with a focus on the pre-training principle this time. As you watch the tutorial, imagine that the material is new to the learner and reflect upon what key concepts you might identify for pre-training so that the learner's cognitive system is not overloaded with the main lesson.
Water is essential to all life on Earth. But how is the water dispersed? This animation shows one molecule of water completing the water cycle. Heat from the sun causes the molecule to evaporate from the ocean's surface. Once it evaporates, it is transported into and through the atmosphere, where water vapor condenses, releasing its heat to form clouds. The water molecule might move halfway around the world before it falls as rain or snow. Once on land, it will either re-evaporate, be used by a plant, drain to the water table, or enter a stream. Streams and rivers bring the water molecule back to where it started, the ocean. Soon, the water molecule will begin its journey again. Now you know how the water cycle, powered by the sun, distributes water and heat around the world.
Understanding that the water cycle involves multiple complex concepts, how could the pre-training principle be applied here so that the video tutorial and continuous presentation be better understood? What if the course was designed so that the key concepts associated with the water cycle were delivered in pre-training before learning about the entire water cycle process? This would allow the learner to consume the most complex concepts of the water cycle at a pace in which essential cognitive processing is managed, as to prevent overload, and done so that the continuous tutorial lesson is consumed with greater understanding. Let's take a look at what that might look like with the pre-training principle applied here. With the pre-training principle applied to our scenario, the menu tabs on the left side of the course, as seen, represent some of the key concepts for the water cycle, and the course can be designed so that the pre-training of these concepts are delivered prior to the main lesson, so that the continuous video tutorial could be consumed with great understanding. In summary, the segmenting and pre-training principles were discussed together because they both involve helping learners in managing their essential processing so that their cognitive systems are not overwhelmed. I hope this presentation was helpful in gaining a better understanding of these principles, and I look forward to your feedback concerning the lesson. And the next time you're designing instruction that is new or complex for your learners, I challenge you to think about how the segmenting and pre-training principles could be applied. Thank you and have a good day.